Hey guys, my name is Trevor Sullivan and welcome back to my video channel. I apologize, it's been a little while since I've created a video. I've been working on some home projects, but I wanted to do another video on Windmill just because it's been such a pleasant piece of open source software to work with so that you can build your own custom applications. One of the integrations that I wanted to demonstrate with Windmill here is how to use a backend system known as Baserow in order to store your data. Now, if you're new to Baserow, you can actually go out to their website at baserow.io and you can check out their product. It's also open source, so there is a free tier that you can self-host. In fact, you can even create your own account on their hosted version, and you can have a limit of 3,000 rows per workspace as well as 2 gigabytes per workspace, but it's really nice to be able to kind of prototype an application before you actually go live with it at production scale. Or you can simply self-host the application as well, and you have access to unlimited rows and unlimited storage based on how much server storage you have on your Linux server. It's really easy to deploy Baserow yourself. I actually have my own self-hosted instance of Baserow, and I can deploy it very easily by using Docker Compose or just a simple one-line Docker CLI command. So by using containers, it makes it really easy to deploy Baserow, and then I actually protect my instance of Baserow along with other self-hosted applications behind Cloudflare tunnels, which allows me to provide a secure access endpoint with TLS encryption to my Baserow service, as well as my Windmill server right over here. So that's how I self-host both of these applications, and we're going to talk about how to kind of integrate these two applications together. So right over here, I've got my self-hosted Baserow server, and if you're new to Baserow, I kind of like to think of it as a database on steroids, so to speak. Basically, it's a database platform that allows you to store kind of row-based data, transactional type of data. But what's really cool about it is that it provides an administrative user interface out of the box, and it also has a REST API. So what this means is that on the client side, as you're developing an application, you don't have to worry about installing any database drivers. You don't have to install a MySQL driver, a PostgreSQL driver, a Microsoft SQL Server driver. You don't have to worry about any of that. You can simply focus on having access to an HTTP client, library, and all the rest is done with Baserow via API calls to its HTTP endpoint. And what's even cooler is that the REST API is actually dynamically generated. So if you see down here, I've got this database down here called Trevor Sullivan's Company, and then I've got a table in there called People. And right now my table schema just has a first name, last name, and a gender field right over here. And so I can insert data rows or query data rows from Baserow by using the REST API. But if I go over to the dashboard and click on API documentation here, it'll actually allow me to choose a database that I want to get automatic generated API documentation for. And as you can see over here on the left-hand side, I can simply click on this people table and say, I want to create a row or insert a row into this people table. And it'll show me exactly how to make that API call, complete with the API endpoint right here. So we can literally just copy and paste that into our application. And then it shows us an example of how to pass one of the objects into that table so that we can create a new record. So we're actually going to be using Python on our back end in order to insert rows, but really you can use any kind of library that allows you to interact with HTTP. So you could use Python requests, you could use HTTP CLI client like curl or HTTPy, for example. You could also use Axios in Node.js applications as a client-side HTTP library. If you're using Rust, there's HTTP libraries for that as well. So again, this REST API just makes Baserow very accessible to different applications without, again, having to install any database drivers. So that's why I really, really like Baserow. But I'm just going to come back to my self-hosted Baserow server here, and we're just going to go ahead and create a new table in our database here, and we'll just call this people number 2. And when you create a new table, it'll have a default schema here, but you can just kind of delete these fields and customize the schema of this table based on your specific needs. So I'm going to go ahead and just delete a couple of these columns right here. So we'll delete those, and then we'll just have name right here. And I'm going to just edit the name of this field, and we'll call it first name instead. And we'll add a new column here, and let's call this a single line text as well, and then we'll give it a name of last name. And then we'll also do a field here called gender. And I'm going to do a single select field here so that you can choose either male or female for the gender, but you'll be restricted to only those two options rather than being able to insert arbitrary data. So what we need to do is just edit this field, and then where it says add an option, we'll just add option number 1, male, and we'll just choose a kind of bluish color here, and then we'll add a second option as female and just choose either a purplish or pinkish color right there just to make it easily visually recognizable. All right, so now we've got our table schema built out, so we need to go into our Windmill application and write a simple Python script in order to insert data into this Baserow table. So let's head back over to the Windmill interface here, and I'm going to go ahead and just create a new workspace. So I've already got one here, but you can just click on plus workspace to create a new workspace right here. But I've got one called Baserow, and now we just want to create a new script here. And I'm going to choose the language down here for Python, just so we can code in Python. And I'm going to give my script a name like Baserow add person. And we'll go ahead and just create that. And then we can eliminate a lot of this boilerplate code up here. So let's just eliminate all that header stuff. We'll go ahead and eliminate all of these input parameters because we're going to define our own custom ones. And then we're just going to eliminate the entire function body here, except for the return statement. So now we'll define a couple of input parameters. So let's say first name as a string. We'll do last name as a string as well. And then we'll do gender as a string. And then inside of the body of our main function right here, this is where we need to make the appropriate HTTP call to the Baserow REST API to insert a new record. So this is going to be really simple. To do this, I'm going to be using a library for Python called HTTPX. So this is similar to the Python requests library, but HTTPX is just another option that you have for doing client-side requests. And there's actually a post method that we can call right here. So if we go into the quick start and look for .post, we can simply post a value into a REST API by using httpx.post. So what we're going to do is just import HTTPX. So we'll say import HTTPX right up here, and Windmill will automatically look at my imports and say, okay, I need to go install this library from the Python package index registry. And so we don't have to manually install it using pip install or anything like that. Windmill just automatically handles that for us. And then down here, what we'll do is say httpx.post. And then we need to specify a bunch of input arguments for this method call so that we can specify the Baserow endpoint, specify an authentication token, and we also need to pass in the actual data or the payload that we want to insert into our Baserow table. So what we need to do is just create a variable here for the URL. So let's just say URL equals, and then we'll go into our Baserow server here. And I'm just going to go ahead and go to my API documentation. So we'll go back to dashboard and click on API docs for Trevor Sullivan Company. And now you can see that people2 table has showed up right here. So we'll just click on that, go down to create row. And right here is the post endpoint that we need to use to insert a record into our Baserow table. So let's just copy that to our clipboard. And then all we need to do is pass in a Python object with first name, last name, and gender into our API call, and that's going to be the payload for our message. We also need to specify the authorization header and set it equal to literally token space, and then the authentication token that we generate from the Baserow interface. So let's come back here and we'll paste in our URL, and then we'll specify URL parameter equals the URL variable. Then we'll set our headers here equal to an object. So let's actually do headers equals Python object. and then we'll say authorization header is equal to token, and then the token that we're going to generate in just a moment. So we'll come back to that in a moment, but for now, I'm just going to say headers equals headers. So we'll take this variable containing a Python dict, and we'll feed that into headers. And then we also need to generate the payload for our message here as well. So what we'll do is just basically take the input arguments from this function, first name, last name, and gender, compile that into a Python dict, and then feed that into the data argument of the HTTPX post method call. So what we'll do is just say body or payload. You can call this variable whatever you want to, but we'll say first name. And then we need to make sure that we match our schema in our table. So we specified our first name field as capital F, capital N. So we'll do that here. And then we'll just set it to the first name input argument from our Python function. Same thing for last name. And then finally, the same thing for gender. The only difference is that gender is going to have a capital G this time instead of a lowercase g like the input argument to our main function has. All right, so now we can take this body and feed it into the data argument here. So we'll say data equals body. And then we need to go ahead and fill out the authentication token right here. So let's go ahead and do that. We'll come back to our Baserow server right here, and we'll come up to our settings and generate a new database token right here. So we'll say create token. We can limit it to a particular workspace, and we'll just say Windmill 2. Choose create token, and then we'll choose to copy that to our clipboard using the 3 little dots right there. And now we can add that as a variable. So we'll just go create a variable here called Baserow token 2, and we'll paste in that value, save that variable, and now we can insert that into our script here. So what I'm going to do is just say token equals variable, and then we'll click on Baserow token 2. And as you can see, it uses the Windmill Python library to call the getVariable function, and that retrieves the token dynamically from our Windmill instance. And then what we need to do is just create an F string here, and we'll substitute the token variable as input to our little Python dict right here. All right, so now we've got our URL endpoint, our authorization header, and our body or payload right here. So now the last thing we need to do is to test out this function before we build a user interface around it. So we'll go ahead and just save that, and we'll test it out. So we'll do Trevor Sullivan, and then mail, and we'll just test this out. And as you can see on the right-hand side right here, it's resolving the Python dependencies automatically. And if necessary, it'll go ahead and install HTTPX and Windmill, and then it will execute your script. So we got no result right here. One thing we could do as well is to capture the result and then print the result here, and that'll just give us a little bit of feedback as to what's happening. So as you can see, we're getting an HTTP 200 OK right here. So let's go ahead and check out our Baserow instance to see if that data actually showed up. So let's go back to our people number 2 table right down here. And sure enough, you can see that we have 2 new records created because I did run the function a second time after I printed the result. So it does allow duplicate records right now with duplicate first name, duplicate last name, and duplicate birth dates and all that, but you could probably add some constraints to prevent that if you wanted to as well. Now, one of the things I like about Baserow as well is that if you have access to a premium version of Baserow, you actually have the ability to add row-level comments. So it kind of allows you to collaborate on your data, and this is a much more advanced feature than what's available in a traditional relational database like MySQL or PostgreSQL, where you don't really have this collaboration feature. You don't have the ability to comment on individual data rows. You can add things like descriptions to fields and tables and things like that, I think, but you don't have the ability to actually add comments from multiple different users and actually collaborate on that data. So that's something in the premium version of Baserow that I think is really cool. All right, so now that we've tested out our function, let's actually test it with an invalid input as well. So if I do like mail 11, for example, that is not going to be a valid input for our Baserow instance. And so you'll see that if we specify an invalid input for our gender field, that we actually get 400 bad request instead of 200 OK. So if I tried to do something like, let's say, Miriam Sullivan, female, and then try to rerun that, you can see that we get HTTP 200 OK because female is a valid gender. But if we do female 11, then once again, we get bad request because that's simply not a valid gender according to the schema that we created in our Baserow instance. Another thing that I like about Baserow is that it updates in real time. So if you add a name like Shelly Sullivan, and then come right back here to Baserow, you can see that as soon as that record is inserted, you immediately see that in the Baserow interface. So you don't have to refresh the view or re-execute a query or anything like that because it just updates in real time. So I really love Baserow for all those different features like real-time updating, the REST interface that it has, the admin user interface or graphical interface that it has as well. And it's just a really nice tool. So I'd encourage you to give Baserow a try. So now we've got a function here in Python in our Windmill instance that allows us to create a new person in our Baserow table. So we can go ahead and deploy this and make it available to consume inside of an application that has a user interface. So now we'll come back to our Baserow workspace in our Windmill instance. And now what we're going to do is just create a simple user interface around this Python script that we created. So let's create a new application here. And let's just add in a couple of fields. Also, one thing I wanted to point out about Windmill is that in a recent release within the past week or so, they've actually added a dark mode. So right down here at the bottom of the left-hand navigation, you can actually toggle light mode, which is the traditional viewing mode, and dark mode. I like to use dark mode because a lot of my work is done at night, and it's just a lot easier on my eyes to look at screens when they have a dark mode applied. It just puts a lot less stress on my vision. So kudos to the Windmill team for adding the dark mode feature. It's really, really nice. So thanks, Ruben and team, for doing that. All right, so in our application here, we're going to add a couple of fields. Let's do a text input right here. Make that a little bit wider, and that'll be our first name. So let's add another text input down here. This time we're going to use a display text field, and let's just call this first name. And then I'll go ahead and just copy and paste this editable text field here. I'm actually going to put the labels on the left, so we'll just kind of move these input fields to the right. And let's move this label right here over to the left. See if I can get it to cooperate right here. All right, so we'll put that over here, do a Control-C and a Control-V, and we'll say last name for this one. And then we'll go ahead and right justify these as well. So we'll go down to alignment and say right justify, do center vertical justification as well. And let's go ahead and do that for the B one there as well. So we'll say right and middle. And now we just need to add one more for gender. But gender is going to be a select item because we only need to be able to select either male or female for the gender, right? So what we're going to do is add in two different static items here. We'll do male, and then female and female. All right, so now we have those two different entries in our drop-down list right here, so you can choose one or the other. And then let's add another label to our application, and let's just call this gender : and that is going to be right justified and center justified as well because we copied it from our other elements. Also, I'm going to put colons after each of these here just so it is very clear that these are labels for each of these input fields. All right, so now we need to make this interactive. So we'll add in a button right here, and we'll just call this, something like add new person or something like that. So we'll make this a little bit wider. We'll say fill container. And for the label, we'll just say add new person. And then we are going to give this an action. So when this is clicked, we want to add an event handler right here. So we'll say select a script or flow, and we'll go to our workspace scripts. Sure enough, here's our Python script with Baserow add person. And then we're going to be prompted for the different inputs. So what we need to do is basically wire up the values from these input fields into the input for this button right here, what's called a runnable input. And that'll just link them together so that we can dynamically pass data from our form into our Baserow database. So what I'm going to do is just specify this little connect dialog right here, or button, and we're going to choose the first input right up here. So this is going to be a result. And then same thing for last name. We're going to say connect, and then we're going to do C dot result. And I really should give these better names. So we'll actually just do that in just a second here. And then for gender, we'll do the same thing, choose E dot result as well. And so what I generally like to do from an application maintenance standpoint is just give these names like txt first name. And then for the next one here, we'll call this txt last name. And for gender here, we'll just say txt gender, or maybe input gender. Since it's not a plain text field, it's just kind of a select field. I'd probably call that select gender or something like that instead, typically. But now what we want to do is just kind of test this out to make sure that everything is wired up properly, right? So on our button down here, let's give this a name like btn add person. And so now when we click this button, it should take the first name, last name, and gender fields and feed them into our Baserow table. So now that we've built our application here, let's go ahead and give it a test run and see if it works the way we expect. So let's just do save initial draft here. I'll do Baserow person, save initial draft, do a deploy operation here. And then let's go into preview mode right here and just type a couple of values and see if it works. So let's do a name like Shannon Jones, and we'll do gender as female. We'll click on add new person, and it looks like everything seems to have worked right. We didn't get any errors back. So let's head over to our Baserow table here. And it looks like for some reason we didn't get any value added to our database here. So let's go ahead and see what is going on. Let me just try it again with a slightly different name and make sure that nothing works here. So we are getting a new row created. It's just not mapping the inputs correctly here. So we seem to have some issue with the input data fields mapping to the actual function inputs. And that's probably because I renamed these different data fields. So let's go back to our button right here, button add person. And sure enough, you can see over under runnable inputs right here, because I connected them up before I renamed the fields, the connection isn't actually valid any longer. So let's do disconnect, disconnect, and disconnect right here, and then we'll just reconnect them each to the appropriate field. Dot result. We'll say last name, result, and then finally gender dot result as well. Let's go ahead and save draft and deploy once again. And now let's try running Shannon Jones, female, and we'll click on add new person. And back in our database here, looks like we aren't getting any results right here. So let's just do a quick refresh. Let me try clicking on that button again. It doesn't look like our function is actually executing this time, so let's see what's going on now. So let's come back to our editor right here and look at our handler. So it is calling Baserow add person, but let's actually look at the executions of our function right here. As you can see, we have a new execution as of a few seconds ago, and it looks like we're getting bad request here. So something about our request is invalid, and I have a feeling that it could be because female is capitalized right here. So let's look at our schema here. And as you can see, in our schema, we specified male and female as lowercase values, not uppercase values. So what I'm going to do is come back to my application, and not our script, but our actual user interface. So we're going to go into our app, and then we'll click on edit down here. And if I take a look at this input gender field right here, you're probably going to see that on the right-hand side, the actual underlying value that maps to these inputs is capital M and capital F for male and female. So I'm going to change the value, not the label. The label is the value that's actually displayed in the user interface, but then the value field indicates what's actually sent to the backend API or script, right? So I'm going to change those to lowercase values. We'll do another save draft right here and redeploy. And then we'll go back over to our preview right here. And let's try Shannon Jones, F for female. Click on add new person. And sure enough, you can see that our new row has been added to our Baserow table. So with a little bit of debugging work there, thanks to the Windmill interface, we can kind of quickly figure out what's going on, make sure everything is wired up correctly from our user interface to our backend Python automation scripts. And with the help of the schema that we defined on Baserow, we could also see that a HTTP 400 bad request was being thrown. So we knew that there was some kind of problem with the request that we were sending to the Baserow server. As soon as we resolved all that, our application started working just perfectly. So in any case, I hope you learned something new from this video about either Baserow or Windmill and just application building in general. As you can see, in literally just several minutes here, I was able to build a simple user interface that allows me to manipulate my Baserow database. And all of this is self-hosted software, which makes it even more cool, right? Thanks for watching this video. Please make sure you like this video, subscribe to the channel down below, leave a comment and let me know what you thought of this video and others on my channel, and we'll see you in the next video. Take care.